For just 1 second, picture it. Everything working. Not almost working, not close to working, everything. The timing, the layering, the cover, the execution. A plan so carefully constructed that even the people paid to find these things didn't see it coming. Not for months, not for years. Now picture it all unraveling because of one word, one single, unnecessary word. That's the case of Marcus Teller, a name that doesn't appear in any major true crime database, doesn't have a documentary, hasn't been given the media treatment it deserves. And yet, inside federal financial crime circles, this case gets referenced constantly. Not because it was the biggest fraud ever executed, but because it came so incredibly close to being invisible. And it almost was. What followed was a 6-year investigation, 3 federal agencies, and a forensic audit trail that spanned 14 countries. But at the center of all of it, underneath all the legal machinery and international coordination, was one man, one system, and one fatal mistake that he made not under pressure, not during a crisis, not when anyone was watching. He made it on a quiet Tuesday afternoon when everything still seemed fine, when he still thought he was untouchable. This is the story of how Marcus Teller built one of the most sophisticated financial fraud operations in recent American history, why it worked for as long as it did, and at exactly what moment it stopped working forever. Let's go back to 2009. The global financial system had just survived the worst economic crash since the Great Depression. Banks were failing, people were losing homes, retirement funds had been gutted. Regulators were overwhelmed, compliance departments were understaffed, auditors were stretched across portfolios that had tripled in complexity overnight. In an environment like that, one of the most economically chaotic periods in modern history, most people were trying to survive. But Marcus Teller was watching something different. He wasn't watching the chaos. He was watching the gaps. Teller was 32 years old in 2009. He had worked in institutional asset management for 9 years, first as a junior analyst in Dallas, then as a portfolio manager for a mid-sized investment advisory firm in Chicago, and finally, briefly, at a boutique wealth management consultancy in New York where he learned 2 things that would define the rest of his professional life. First, that ultra-high net worth clients hate attention. They move money quietly, build structures quietly, and they hate having their financial arrangements scrutinized. Second, that the systems designed to monitor those movements were not designed for the speed at which modern capital actually flowed. The compliance infrastructure was, in his words, built for a different era. He was right, and he knew exactly what to do with that knowledge. In early 2010, Teller incorporated a wealth management advisory firm called Meridian Clarity Group, registered in Delaware, with a secondary office address in Zurich and a shell consulting entity in the Cayman Islands. On paper, it was a legitimate boutique advisory operation. Mid-level clients, modest AUM, clean documentation. In practice, it was an architecture. The actual mechanics of what Teller built deserve real attention because this is not a story about someone who stole money clumsily. This is a story about someone who understood regulatory thresholds, audit cycles, correspondent banking relationships, and beneficial ownership blind spots with the precision of someone who had spent years studying the system from the inside. Here is what he built. Meridian Clarity Group would solicit clients, real clients, legitimate clients, people with real money, offering discretionary investment management. Those clients signed real contracts, received real quarterly statements, believed they were part of a legitimate operation. And in the early phase, the investments were real. Money went into actual positions. Returns were generated. Relationships were established. Trust was built. But underneath that visible layer was a second architecture. Teller had set up a network of 11 limited liability companies spread across 4 jurisdictions: Delaware, Wyoming, the British Virgin Islands, and Malta, each connected to the others through intercompany loan agreements, management fee structures, and royalty payments that existed purely on paper. The money would flow from client accounts into legitimate positions. A percentage of those legitimate returns would then be siphoned through what appeared to be advisory fee payments to these shell entities. And within those shells, the funds were layered through a series of transactions designed to lose their audit trail across jurisdictions. Here's where Teller showed his real sophistication. He never moved large sums at once. The transactions were calibrated to remain beneath automatic reporting thresholds in every jurisdiction they touched. He rotated correspondent banking relationships every 18 months to prevent pattern analysis. He hired a legitimate Maltese accounting firm, one with real credentials, a real client list, and zero knowledge of the broader structure, to file clean returns for the Maltese entity. He used a different firm for the BVI structures. He used a third for the Delaware subsidiaries. No single accountant had visibility into the full picture. Each one saw only what they were supposed to see. He also understood something that most financial criminals don't, that regulators are not primarily looking for small anomalies. They're looking for large ones. They're looking for sudden movements, unusual concentrations, flagged transactions. So Teller kept everything small, everything slow, everything quiet. By 2014, Meridian Clarity Group had $340 million in assets under management. The legitimate side of the operation was profitable on its own. The clients were happy. The quarterly reports were detailed, professional, and entirely convincing. And through the Shell network, Teller had personally extracted just under $22 million over 4 years, averaging roughly $5.5 million a year, without triggering a single regulatory inquiry. Not one. He was living in a penthouse apartment in Lincoln Park, Chicago. He drove a matte gray Porsche 911. He spent weekends in Scottsdale and summers in the south of France. He gave to charity. He attended industry conferences and spoke occasionally on regulatory compliance panels, which, if you're looking for proof that the man had a sense of humor about all of this, there it is. By every visible metric, Marcus Teller was simply a successful man in a successful industry. And to anyone watching from the outside, that's exactly what he looked like. But here's what this is really about. Because none of what came next, the federal investigation, the arrests, the international asset freeze, would have happened if Teller had just followed his own rules. Every single protocol he had built, every structural safeguard, every carefully engineered blind spot in the system, it all pointed in one direction. Keep distance. Stay anonymous. Let the architecture speak for itself. Never create unnecessary documentation. Never create unnecessary exposure. He knew this. He had written it, in effect, into the very DNA of the structure. And then, on a Tuesday afternoon in September 2016, he broke his own first rule. But we'll get there. First, we need to understand why 2015 and 2016 mattered. Because that's when the pressure started. Not regulatory pressure. Not yet. Internal pressure. By mid-2015, Teller had added several new high-net-worth clients to Meridian Clarity's roster, including 2 families whose combined AUM contribution pushed the firm's total well above $400 million. The visible business was booming. But those new clients came with expectations. 2 of them had employed their own independent accounting advisors who began requesting audit access. Not hostile access, not suspicious access, just the standard documentation review that large investors regularly commission. This was entirely normal. And Teller had always anticipated it. He had documentation layers prepared specifically for this scenario. What he hadn't anticipated was the addition of one of those clients' advisors, a forensic accountant named Patricia Sue, based in San Francisco, who had a reputation in institutional circles for being unusually thorough. She wasn't investigating Meridian Clarity. She wasn't suspicious. She was simply doing what she always did, which was reading everything. Every document, every footnote, every intercompany agreement, every management fee disclosure. She found nothing actionable, nothing. The documentation was clean. The architecture was invisible. She completed her review in November 2015, filed a standard advisory report to her client, and closed the engagement with no flags raised. But she had asked several questions during the review that Teller had not expected. Not damaging questions, just precise ones. Questions about the fee calculation methodology for a particular management agreement with one of the BVI entities. Nothing in the documentation answered her question directly, and Teller's compliance team had been forced to construct a supplemental memo explaining the structure. That memo was technically correct, entirely defensible, but it was an additional document, one that hadn't existed before, one that hadn't been planned, one that connected even loosely two elements of the structure that Teller had deliberately kept separated. He knew this. He reviewed the memo personally. He almost had it recalled and rewritten. He didn't. The client relationship was too important. The timing was sensitive. He filed the memo, closed the review, and told himself the risk was manageable. That was the first crack. Not because the memo was evidence of wrongdoing, but because it introduced a thread. A small, almost invisible thread that connected two things that were supposed to have no relationship with each other. And in a system built entirely on the absence of visible connections, the presence of even one, even an innocent seeming one, is something that can be followed. At that moment, though, Teller probably thought it was behind him. The review was closed. The client was satisfied. Sue had found nothing. Life continued. But threads don't disappear just because you stop looking at them. In early 2016, a completely unrelated investigation by the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, FinCEN, into a separate money laundering network operating through shell companies in Malta, and the BVI identified one of the correspondent banking relationships that Teller's structure had been using 18 months earlier. Not a current one. He had rotated that relationship out in 2014, exactly as his protocol dictated. But in reconstructing the earlier network's transaction history, FinCEN analysts ran a standard expansion query across all entities that had used that correspondent banking corridor during the same window. Meridian Clarity Group's BVI entity appeared in the query results, not as a suspect, not as a target, as a data point, one of hundreds of legitimate and semi-legitimate entities that had used the same banking corridor during that period. Standard procedure at this stage would have been to flag it for low-priority review, pass it to a compliance desk, and, in the vast majority of cases, clear it within 60 days. Except that among the FinCEN analyst team reviewing that particular expansion dataset was a junior analyst named Devin Marsh, 3 years out of Georgetown, detail-oriented in the way that only people who genuinely love the work tend to be, who happened to run a second-layer cross-reference before filing his preliminary clearance recommendation. A cross-reference that pulled beneficial ownership filings for every entity in the dataset across all 4 jurisdictions simultaneously. It was not a standard step. It was not required by protocol. Marsh just did it because he always did it, because he found the patterns interesting. The cross-reference pulled an anomaly. Small, easily explainable. In fact, there was an explanation built into the structure that would have covered it. Except, and here is where Teller's earlier problem compounded, the explanation that should have covered it contradicted the supplemental memo that had been filed for Patricia Sue's review in November 2015. Not dramatically, not obviously. The contradiction was subtle enough that any reasonable compliance reviewer would have accepted either explanation individually without question. But Marsh had both documents, and he noticed they didn't quite say the same thing about the relationship between the BVI entity and one of the Delaware LLCs. He flagged it. Low priority. Recommended for secondary review. The flag sat in a queue for 11 weeks. Then it got picked up. And this is where the structure that Teller had spent 6 years building started to show its deepest vulnerability. Not its complexity, but its fragility. Because complex systems are often fragile systems. Every additional layer that had been added to make the architecture invisible had also created an additional surface where, under the right angle of scrutiny, a single inconsistency could become visible. The secondary reviewer assigned to Marsh's flag was a senior FinCEN analyst with 12 years of experience in cross-jurisdictional fraud investigation. She pulled Meridian Clarity Group's full public filing history across all 4 jurisdictions. She reviewed the Sue memo. She mapped the intercompany fee structure as it appeared in the official documentation. And within 2 weeks of her first look, she escalated to her supervisor with a recommendation for formal investigation. She did not yet know what she had found. She knew only that something about the documentation topology didn't fit the way legitimately structured advisory firms were typically organized. She couldn't point to a crime. She could only point to a shape that was slightly wrong. That was enough. In August 2016, a joint investigation was formally opened. FinCEN, the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, and the SEC's Asset Management Compliance Unit. At this stage, Teller knew nothing about any of it. The investigation was sealed. The agencies were operating quietly, requesting documents through regulatory channels that appeared routine, building a financial reconstruction of the structure before making any overt moves. And here is where we arrive at September 2016. The investigators needed one more piece, a direct connection between Marcus Teller personally and the beneficial ownership of the BVI entities. The documentary structure had been designed to keep his name at one remove from those entities at all times. He was not listed as a beneficial owner. He was not a signatory. His name appeared nowhere in the formal documentation of the shells. His connection ran through a nominee arrangement, a named intermediary who served on paper as the controlling party, and that nominee, a Maltese national named Andre Vella, was entirely legitimate, meaning he had no criminal history, and entirely compliant, meaning he answered questions honestly when regulatory authorities asked them, and entirely unaware, meaning he did not know the full scope of what he had nominally agreed to control. The investigators were working to establish the Teller-Vella BVI chain through financial transaction reconstruction, but it was slow. The paper trail had been deliberately degraded at the key connection point. They had circumstantial evidence, they needed documentary evidence. And then Teller gave it to them. Not under pressure, not during questioning, not in a crisis moment. On a Tuesday afternoon in September 2016, Marcus Teller sent an email. He sent it to his personal assistant, asking her to follow up on a wire transfer that had been delayed. The wire transfer was from one of the BVI entities. He referred to it in the email as my account. 2 words, my account. He had spent 6 years building an architecture specifically designed to ensure that those 2 words could never be truthfully placed in the same sentence with any reference to those entities. The entire legal and documentary construction of the structure existed to prevent exactly this, a direct first-person claim of ownership. And in a moment of routine impatience dealing with a delayed wire on an otherwise ordinary afternoon, he wrote it. Not to an investigator, not to a regulator. To his personal assistant, who then forwarded the message to the relevant banking contact. That email entered a monitored communications channel. By the following morning, it had been flagged and routed to the Joint Investigation Team. The investigation had its documentary link. From that point forward, the timeline collapsed with extraordinary speed. Within 3 weeks, federal warrants had been issued. Within 6 weeks, asset freezes had been executed across all 4 jurisdictions. Within 4 months, Teller was under formal indictment on 14 counts, including wire fraud, tax evasion, money laundering, and securities fraud. Vella cooperated fully with investigators. 3 of the 11 shell entities were traced back to Teller's direct control within the first month of full forensic access. The Sue memo, the FinCEN anomaly, and the September 2016 email formed the documentary spine of a prosecution that would ultimately result in a 22-year federal sentence handed down in May 2019. $22 million recovered. Another $8 million in associated penalties and asset forfeiture. The clients, the legitimate ones, the ones who had trusted their capital to Meridian Clarity Group, faced a complex resolution process that took years and returned less than full value to the most heavily impacted accounts. Several of them have spoken publicly about the experience. The words they use are consistent: betrayal, violation, disbelief. Because from where they sat, nothing had seemed wrong. Everything had seemed professional, diligent, and trustworthy. That was the point. That had always been the point. Now step back from the timeline for a moment, because the forensic reconstruction of this case, published in partial form as part of the FinCEN's post-prosecution analysis in 2020, reveals something that goes beyond Teller's individual choices. It reveals a structural argument about how sophisticated financial fraud actually operates, and why the systems designed to catch it so often don't. The investigation was not triggered by a regulatory sweep. It was not triggered by a client complaint. It was not triggered by a bank reporting suspicious activity in real time, which is the mechanism that anti-money laundering frameworks rely on as their first line of defense. The investigation was triggered by a junior analyst at FinCEN doing something that wasn't strictly required of him, running one extra cross-reference out of personal habit before filing a clearance recommendation. Remove Devin Marsh from that desk on that day, and the trajectory of this case almost certainly looks different. The supplemental memo exists, but without the FinCEN cross-reference anomaly to give it context, it remains permanently invisible. The investigation doesn't open. The email from September 2016 still gets sent, but no one is monitoring that channel, so it goes nowhere. The entire case pivots on one analyst choosing to do one additional check that he wasn't required to do. That is not a comforting thought for anyone who believes that complex fraud is being systematically detected by the systems built to detect it. And that's the part of this case that the formal legal narrative tends to underemphasize, because the legal narrative is about Teller's guilt, which is clear and total. But the systemic narrative, the one that matters for everyone who isn't Marcus Teller, is about the fact that a 6-year fraud operation affecting hundreds of millions of dollars was running cleanly, invisibly, and without a single regulatory flag, until a chain of accidents aligned in precisely the right sequence. The Sioux Review happened to produce a memo that happened to create an inconsistency that happened to appear in a dataset that happened to be reviewed by an analyst who happened to run an extra query. Every one of those elements is contingent. Remove any one of them and the outcome is different. Teller understood the system well enough to design around its systematic components. What he couldn't design around was the unsystematic ones. The analyst who went one step further than required. The memo that survived when it shouldn't have. The email sent in a moment of irritation on a Tuesday afternoon. He had built his protection against the machine. He hadn't built protection against the human moments inside it. That's the architecture of his failure. And now consider the error itself. My account. With full awareness of what it represented, this was not a moment of ignorance. Teller knew with absolute precision what those two words meant from a legal standpoint. He had structured 6 years of meticulous documentation specifically to prevent anyone from ever being able to attach those words to that account. He understood beneficial ownership law. He understood evidentiary standards. He understood exactly what a first-person ownership claim, documented in writing, entering a monitored communication channel could do to his position. He knew all of it, and he wrote it anyway. Why? Because at the moment he wrote it, he was not thinking like a man operating a 6-year fraud architecture. He was thinking like a man dealing with an annoying wire transfer delay. He was thinking about the $340,000 that was late and the meeting he had that afternoon and the dinner reservation he had that evening. He was thinking like a person who had been operating comfortably inside a protected environment for so long that the protection had started to feel like reality. This is what sustained operational security actually does to the human beings operating within it. It normalizes. The procedures that felt urgent and critical in 2010 had, by 2016, become routine background noise. The vigilance that had once been constant had, over 6 years, become contextual, applied when it felt relevant, released when things felt stable. And that is not a psychological weakness unique to Marcus Teller. That is a predictable human response to an absence of threat signals over an extended period. When nothing goes wrong for long enough, the brain begins to classify the precautionary behaviors as excessive. It does this automatically, without announcement, without conscious decision. It simply begins to lower the threat assessment of situations that haven't produced negative outcomes. And the behavioral protocols that were calibrated for high threat become gradually a burden that the conscious mind starts to quietly deprioritize. Teller had received no threat signals for 6 years. 6 years of clean operations, satisfied clients, clear audits, and a growing business. The machine had worked so well for so long that the person running it had unconsciously begun to treat it as a machine that ran itself. The email was not a moment of criminal recklessness. It was a moment of psychological normalization. And that is, if anything, a more disturbing thing, because it is far more universal. Because it means the error was not the product of a unique flaw in Marcus Teller. It was the product of something that operates in every human being who has ever operated under sustained procedural discipline for an extended period without negative reinforcement. The most dangerous moment in any long-running operation is not the crisis. It is the absence of crisis. When everything feels secure, the security behaviors become invisible. And when they become invisible, they become unreliable. And when they become unreliable, in the right combination of circumstances at the right moment, they fail. 2 words: my account. The system held for 6 years against systematic scrutiny, regulatory sweeps, sophisticated client audits, and 2 major compliance reviews. It held against everything that was designed and deployed to find it. And it broke against something that wasn't designed to find it at all: a junior analyst's personal habit and a man's impatience on an ordinary afternoon. The last detail worth noting: Teller was sentenced in a Chicago federal courthouse in May 2019. He gave no statement at sentencing. His defense counsel argued, as expected, that the beneficial ownership documentation did not clearly establish his direct control. The argument failed. The September 2016 email was in evidence. The phrase "my account" was read into the record by the prosecution. The judge sentenced him to 22 years. As he was led out of the courtroom, according to one account from a journalist present that day, he looked calm. People who were in the room have described his expression as flat, controlled. Not the expression of a man who had just been surprised. The expression, perhaps, of a man who had known for a long time exactly how this would end once the chain had started, who had watched the dominoes fall with full understanding of what each one meant, and who had simply run out of room to do anything but wait for the last one. That expression, if the account is accurate, is perhaps the most revealing detail of the entire case. Not the fraud, not the architecture, not the federal warrants. The expression of a man who understood exactly what had happened, and understood exactly why. And the truth that hangs over this case, the one that makes it uncomfortable to simply file away as a story about a criminal who got what he deserved, is this: the error was not extraordinary, the error was human. It was the kind of error that emerges not from stupidity or carelessness or recklessness, but from the quiet psychological drift that happens to everyone who operates inside a structure, any structure, for long enough. The moment where the procedures that were once active and intentional become passive and habitual. The moment where the vigilance becomes performance. That moment does not announce itself. It does not send signals. It arrives as an ordinary afternoon, a minor frustration, an email typed and sent in 30 seconds without a second thought. And it doesn't look like anything until afterward, when everything is already irreversible, when the thread has been pulled and the architecture is unwinding, and someone goes back to locate the exact coordinate where the structure stopped being a protection and started being a liability. A Tuesday afternoon, September 2016. 2 words. The question isn't whether Marcus Teller should have known better. The question is, and in the same circumstances after 6 years with the same operational history, under the same psychological conditions, would you have? The files on cases like this one don't close easily. They leave questions. And sometimes the most important question isn't who committed the crime. It's what the crime reveals about the systems that were supposed to prevent it, and the human nature that operates inside all of them.